Good evening and welcome back to Peaceful Dreams, your nightly companion for rest and relaxation. I'm so grateful you've chosen to spend these quiet moments with us tonight. Tonight, we're traveling to a most extraordinary place. A secret garden hidden behind ancient stone walls, where flowers bloom only under the silver light of the moon, and where a gentle gardener tends to miraculous plants that sleep during the day and awaken when darkness falls. This is a place where time moves differently, where the night air carries perfumes that exist nowhere else in the world, and where magic lives in every petal and leaf. Before we begin tonight's journey, I want to remind you to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our nightly stories designed to help you drift into the most peaceful sleep. These stories are crafted specifically to quiet your mind, slow your breathing, and guide you gently toward rest. Find your most comfortable position, perhaps adjusting your pillow just so, letting your shoulders drop and taking a deep, slow breath. Allow yourself to sink into this story, knowing that you're safe, you're cared for, and you're exactly where you need to be. Let us begin our journey into the Midnight Garden. The iron gate stood slightly open, its ancient hinges silent despite their age. Beyond the weathered stone archway lay a garden unlike any other in the world. A place where ordinary rules did not apply, where flowers bloomed only in darkness, and where the silver light of the moon brought forth wonders that daylight could never reveal. Eleanor Ashworth moved slowly along the cobblestone path, her bare feet making no sound on the cool stones. At 68, she had been the keeper of this midnight garden for more than 40 years, and every step she took was guided by memory and instinct as much as sight. The moon hung full and bright overhead, casting everything in shades of silver and deep blue, transforming the familiar into something magical. The path wound gently through the garden, curving around ancient oak trees whose branches formed natural archways overhead. Spanish moss hung like silver curtains from the limbs, stirring gently in the night breeze and creating shifting patterns of light and shadow on the ground below. Eleanor moved without hurry, carrying an old wooden watering can in one hand and a small basket of gardening tools in the other. As the church bells in the distant village struck midnight, the garden began to stir. It was a subtle transformation at first, the faintest shimmer in the air, a gentle rustling of leaves where no wind had touched them, the barely audible sound of petals unfolding like whispered secrets in the darkness. Eleanor paused at the first flower bed, setting down her watering can and basket beside a low stone bench that had been worn smooth by decades of use. Here, the moonlight jasmine grew in carefully tended rows, its vines climbing up tall wooden trellises that Eleanor's late husband had built with his own hands so many years ago. During the day, the jasmine appeared completely ordinary green leaves and tightly closed buds that looked as if they might never open. But as midnight approached, the magic began. The transformation was always slow, always gentle, like watching time itself unfold in petals of pure white. Eleanor knelt beside the first trellis, her knees finding the soft cushions she had placed there for comfort during her nightly rounds. The jasmine buds were already beginning to swell, their tight green casings loosening as the flowers prepared to emerge. One by one, the buds began to open. The process was mesmerizing, each petal unfurling with deliberate grace, revealing centers that glowed with their own soft light. The fragrance that emerged was unlike anything that existed in the daylight world, a scent so pure and sweet that it seemed to wash away the day's worries with each breath Eleanor took. She reached out with gentle fingers to touch one of the newly opened blooms. The petals felt cool and smooth, almost liquid to the touch, and they pulsed with a gentle light that matched the rhythm of her own heartbeat. This was the magic of the midnight garden flowers that lived in harmony with those who tended them, that responded to touch and care with displays of beauty that existed nowhere else in the world. Eleanor picked up her small watering can and began to tend to the jasmine. The water she used was special, collected from the stone fountain at the garden's center during the full moon, blessed by starlight and infused with the essence of night-blooming herbs. As she poured the silvery liquid onto the soil around each plant, she could hear the soft sighs of contentment from the flowers themselves. The jasmine vines stretched and twisted as she worked, their growth visible to the naked eye in the moonlight. New buds formed even as older blooms reached their full glory, creating a continuous cycle of flowering that would last until the first rays of dawn touched the garden. Eleanor moved along the row slowly, methodically, speaking in soft whispers to each plant as she tended it. Beyond the jasmine beds, other flowers were beginning to stir. The lunar roses grew in perfect spirals around the ancient sundial at the garden's heart, their silver-white blooms opening like stars against the dark earth. During the day, these roses existed only as thorny stems with no leaves or buds visible. But under the moon's influence, they transformed into cascading fountains of luminous beauty. Eleanor made her way toward the rose spirals, her bare feet finding the familiar stepping stones that led between the beds. The night air was cool and gentle, carrying the mixed fragrances of the awakening garden. Jasmine and roses, but also the stranger sense of flowers that had no earthly names, blooms that existed only in this magical space between day and night. The lunar roses were beginning their nightly transformation as Eleanor approached. The process was different from the jasmine, more dramatic, more sudden. Where the jasmine unfolded gradually, the roses burst into bloom all at once, their petals exploding outward in showers of silver light that fell like gentle rain onto the dark soil below. Eleanor settled onto the low stone wall that surrounded the rose beds, placing her tools beside her and simply watching the magnificent display. Each rose as it bloomed sent out a pulse of soft light, and when viewed from above, the spiral pattern of the beds created a galaxy of stars spinning slowly around the ancient sundial. The sight never failed to fill her with wonder, even after all these years of witnessing this nightly miracle. The roses sang as they bloomed, a sound so soft it was almost inaudible, like wind chimes made of starlight and moonbeams. Eleanor closed her eyes and listened to this celestial music, feeling the day's tensions melt away from her shoulders and back. This was why she had devoted her life to the midnight garden, why she had chosen to live in solitude in the small cottage at its edge, why she spent every night from midnight until dawn tending to flowers that the rest of the world would never see. When the roses had finished their transformation, Eleanor rose from the wall and continued along the winding path. The garden was larger than it appeared from the entrance, stretching back into shadowy groves and hidden alcoves where the most mysterious flowers grew. Each section had its own character, its own particular magic, and Eleanor knew them all as intimately as a mother knows her children. The next beds contained the dream lilies, tall stalks topped with buds that looked like closed eyes during the daylight hours. As Eleanor approached, these buds were beginning to flutter and twitch, as if the flowers within were stirring from deep sleep. The dream lilies were among the most sensitive flowers in the garden, responding not only to moonlight but to the thoughts and emotions of those who tended them. Eleanor knelt beside the first lily stalk and placed her hands gently on the cool earth around its base. The plant seemed to sense her presence, its leaves rustling softly in welcome. Slowly, carefully, she began to water the soil, watching as each drop of moon-blessed water seemed to absorb into the earth with a faint silver glow. As the water soaked into the soil, the dream lily buds began to open, revealing petals of deep purple and midnight blue that seemed to contain entire galaxies of stars. But it was not just their appearance that made these flowers special. It was their gift. Each bloom, when fully opened, released a gentle mist that carried with it the power to bring peaceful dreams to anyone who breathed it in. Eleanor inhaled deeply as the first lily released its magical mist, feeling the familiar sensation of calm that spread through her mind and body. The mist tasted of lavender and vanilla, with undertones of something sweeter and more mysterious, the essence of perfect sleep, of rest without worry or fear. One by one, the dream lilies opened their star-filled petals, until the entire bed was shrouded in a gentle, silvery mist that swirled and eddied in the night breeze. Eleanor moved among the stalks like a figure in a dream herself, tending to each plant with the devoted care that had kept the garden blooming for generations. As she worked, Eleanor thought about the history of this place, the stories that had been passed down to her by the previous keeper, an ancient woman named Magdalena who had tended the garden for nearly a century before passing the responsibility to Eleanor. The midnight garden was older than memory, older than the village beyond its walls, older perhaps than the very stones of the earth on which it grew. According to legend, the garden had been created by a sorceress who had grown tired of the harsh light of day, who had longed for a place where beauty could exist in gentleness and peace. She had gathered seeds from flowers that grew on the moon itself, had planted them in soil blessed by starlight, and had woven spells of protection around the garden that would keep it safe from the intrusion of daylight and the outside world. Whether the legends were true or not, Eleanor had seen enough magic in her years as keeper to believe that this place was touched by forces beyond ordinary understanding. The flowers here did not follow natural laws. They bloomed without sunlight, thrived in conditions that would kill ordinary plants, and possessed abilities that no earthly flower could claim. Eleanor finished tending to the dream lilies and moved deeper into the garden, following a path that led through a grove of night-blooming oaks. These ancient trees were covered in small, white flowers that opened only in darkness, their blossoms releasing a gentle phosphorescence that provided a soft, natural light for the garden's nocturnal activities. The oak grove was one of Eleanor's favorite parts of the garden, a peaceful space where she often came to rest during her nightly rounds. The trees grew in a perfect circle around a small clearing where wildflowers carpeted the ground, flowers that changed color throughout the night, shifting from deep purple at midnight to pale silver as dawn approached. Eleanor settled onto a fallen log that served as a natural bench in the center of the clearing. She set her watering can and tools aside and simply sat in the gentle glow of the oak blossoms, listening to the night sounds of the garden, the soft whisper of opening petals, the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze, the distant splash of water from the central fountain. The wildflowers at her feet were beginning to stir, their petals shifting from the deep purple of midnight toward the lighter shades that would mark the progress of the night. This transformation happened gradually, imperceptibly, like watching the hands of a clock move or observing the phases of the moon. It was one of the many ways the garden marked time, providing a natural calendar for those who understood its rhythms. Eleanor reached into her basket and withdrew a small, leather-bound journal, a record she had kept of the garden's nightly transformations for more than 4 decades. By the light of the phosphorescent oak blossoms, she made her first entry of the night. October 15th. Midnight garden awakening proceeds normally. Moonlight jasmine opened at 12:05. Lunar roses in full bloom by 12:20. Dream lilies releasing optimal mist levels. Temperature mild, humidity perfect. All plantings healthy and vigorous. The journal contained thousands of such entries, a detailed record of every night Eleanor had spent in the garden. She had documented the subtle changes that occurred with the seasons, the effects of different weather patterns on the blooming cycles, the mysterious fluctuations in magical energy that seemed to ebb and flow according to patterns only the garden itself understood. As she wrote, Eleanor became aware of a soft chiming sound emanating from deeper in the garden. The crystal bells were beginning to ring. These were perhaps the most unusual flowers in the entire magical space, appearing during the day as simple green stems with no visible blooms, but transforming at night into delicate, translucent flowers that rang like tiny bells when touched by the night breeze. Eleanor closed her journal and rose from the log, gathering her tools and making her way toward the sound of the chiming. The path wound through more beds of night-blooming flowers, midnight poppies with their black and silver petals, starlight daisies that glowed with their own inner fire, moon orchids that changed shape throughout the night like living sculptures. Each variety of flower had its own schedule, its own particular way of responding to the phases of the moon and the progression of the night hours. Eleanor knew them all, had studied their habits and needs for decades, had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when each plant was thriving or when it needed special attention. The crystal bells grew in a section of the garden where the moonlight seemed particularly bright, as if the flowers themselves drew down additional lunar energy. As Eleanor approached, she could see the delicate, glass-like blooms swaying gently in the breeze, their surfaces reflecting the moonlight in prismatic colors that painted rainbow patterns on the surrounding foliage. The sound they made was ethereal, like wind chimes crafted from starlight itself. Each flower produced a slightly different tone, and together they created harmonies that seemed to change and shift with every breath of wind. Eleanor stood among them for several minutes, simply listening to their celestial music and feeling the peace it brought to her spirit. These flowers required different care from the others in the garden. Instead of water, they thrived on gentle vibrations, the sound of footsteps on the stone paths, the whisper of wind through leaves, the distant chiming of church bells from the village. Eleanor knelt among them and began to sing, very softly, an old lullaby her grandmother had taught her many years ago. As her voice joined the chiming of the crystal bells, the flowers seemed to respond, their ringing becoming more musical, more harmonious. This was another of the garden's mysteries, the way certain flowers responded to human presence, to emotion, to the simple act of caring attention. Eleanor had learned over the years that the garden was not just a collection of magical plants, but a living entity that thrived on love and devotion. The night was still young, and Eleanor had many more beds to tend before dawn would come to close the garden's magical blooming cycle. She rose from among the crystal bells and continued along the winding path, her movements unhurried and contemplative. This was her time, these hours between midnight and dawn when the world belonged to shadows and starlight, when ordinary concerns fell away and only the eternal rhythms of growth and beauty mattered. The path led next to the fountain of liquid starlight, the heart of the midnight garden where all paths eventually converged. The fountain was ancient beyond measure, carved from a single block of white stone that seemed to glow with its own inner light. Water flowed continuously from a carved moon at its center, cascading down in gentle stages to collect in a circular pool at its base. But this was not ordinary water that flowed from the fountain. During the hours of darkness, the water became liquid starlight, a silvery substance that moved like water but glowed with the soft radiance of distant stars. This was the source of the moon-blessed water Eleanor used to tend the garden, water that had been transformed by lunar energy into something magical and pure. Eleanor set down her watering can and dipped it into the fountain, watching as the liquid starlight swirled and eddied around the container. The water felt cool and tingly against her skin, and she could feel its energy flowing up through her hands and arms, renewing her strength for the long night ahead. Around the fountain, the most precious flowers in the garden grew in carefully tended beds. Here were the lunar orchids that bloomed in patterns that matched the constellations overhead, the shadow roses that seemed to be made of solidified moonbeams, the night-blooming jasmine that grew nowhere else in the world and filled the air with its intoxicating perfume. Eleanor began to tend these special flowers with extra care, knowing that they were the most sensitive to changes in lunar energy and required the most attention. Each plant was unique. Each had its own personality and needs, and Eleanor had learned over the decades to communicate with them in ways that went beyond ordinary gardening. She knelt beside a cluster of shadow roses, their petals seeming to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating flowers that appeared to be cut from the fabric of night itself. These roses bloomed only during the darkest hours, their beauty visible only to those who had learned to see in darkness, to appreciate the subtle gradations of shadow and starlight that most people missed. As Eleanor tended to the shadow roses, she heard a soft rustling from the nearby whispering violets, tiny flowers that grew close to the ground and were said to carry messages on the night wind. She paused in her work to listen, but tonight the violets seemed content to simply whisper among themselves, sharing secrets in a language only they understood. The fountain area was the social center of the garden, if such a term could be applied to plants. Here, the different flowers seemed to interact with each other in ways that defied explanation. The lunar orchids would shift their patterns to complement the blooming cycles of nearby roses. The crystal bells would adjust their chiming to harmonize with the whispers of the violets. The shadow roses would deepen or lighten their petals in response to the glow of the starlight fountain. Eleanor had observed these interactions for years without fully understanding them. The garden seemed to have its own intelligence, its own way of maintaining balance and harmony among its diverse inhabitants. Her role was not to control or direct this process, but simply to provide the care and attention that allowed the garden's natural magic to flourish. As she worked around the fountain, Eleanor felt the deep satisfaction that came from being part of something larger than herself. The midnight garden was her life's work, her calling, her gift to the world, even though the world would never know of its existence. The garden's magic was too fragile, too precious to be exposed to the harsh light of day or the curious eyes of those who might not understand its delicate nature. The church bells in the distance chimed 1 o'clock, marking the passage of the first hour since the garden's awakening. Eleanor paused in her work to listen to the familiar sound, using it to gauge her progress through the night's tending routine. She had learned over the years to pace herself, to ensure that she could visit every section of the garden during the precious hours of darkness. Leaving the fountain area, Eleanor followed a smaller path that led to one of the garden's most mysterious sections, the grove of memory trees. These ancient willows grew in a circle around a small pond, their drooping branches creating a natural cathedral of green and silver. During the day, the trees appeared ordinary, but at night, their leaves shimmered with phosphorescent light, and their branches moved without any wind to stir them. The memory trees were said to hold within their bark and leaves the recollections of everyone who had ever tended the midnight garden. As Eleanor entered the grove, she could feel the presence of those who had come before her: Magdalena, who had taught her the garden's secrets; Marcus, who had built the trellises and benches; Celeste, who had first planted the crystal bells according to the patterns of the stars. Eleanor moved slowly around the pond at the center of the grove, carrying her watering can filled with liquid starlight. The memory trees did not require water in the ordinary sense, but they thrived on the attention and care of those who tended them. As she approached each tree, Eleanor could sense its individual personality, its particular collection of stored memories and experiences. The first tree she came to was the oldest, its trunk so massive that Eleanor could not reach her arms around it even halfway. This tree held the deepest memories, the oldest secrets of the garden's origins and purpose. Eleanor placed her hand on its bark and felt the familiar tingle of connection, as if the tree were sharing just a tiny fraction of its accumulated wisdom. She moved around the grove slowly, visiting each tree in turn. Some were younger, holding the memories of more recent keepers. Others were ancient beyond imagining, their roots extending deep into the earth, where they touched the magical foundations of the garden itself. Each tree required different care. Some needed the liquid starlight poured onto their roots. Others responded better to gentle touches and whispered words of encouragement. As Eleanor worked, she felt the presence of the garden's history surrounding her like a gentle embrace. This was perhaps the most sacred part of her nightly routine, the time when she felt most connected to the eternal tradition of tending the midnight garden. Here, among the memory trees, the barriers between past and present seemed to dissolve, and Eleanor could sense the continuous chain of devotion that had kept the garden alive for centuries. The pond at the center of the grove reflected the moonlight like a mirror, its surface disturbed only by the occasional ripple from a night-blooming water lily opening its petals. These lilies were among the most beautiful flowers in the entire garden, their blooms floating on the dark water like stars that had fallen from the sky. Eleanor knelt at the pond's edge and watched the water lilies as they completed their nightly transformation. Unlike the other flowers in the garden, these lilies opened very slowly, taking hours to fully unfurl their petals. The process was mesmerizing, each petal emerging like a dancer taking her place on stage, contributing to a performance of such beauty that it seemed to stop time itself. The fragrance of the water lilies was subtle but profound, a scent that seemed to bypass the nose and speak directly to the soul. Eleanor breathed it in deeply, feeling the familiar sense of peace and connection that these special flowers always brought. They were among the oldest plants in the garden, possibly dating back to its very creation, and they carried within their cells the pure essence of the garden's original magic. As the lilies continued their slow dance of opening, Eleanor made entries in her journal, documenting the precise timing of each bloom, the subtle variations in color and size that marked the health and vitality of each plant. These records were important not just for her own reference, but for the keeper who would eventually succeed her, just as Magdalena's careful notes had guided Eleanor during her early years in the garden. The thought of eventually passing the garden to another keeper was both comforting and melancholy. Eleanor had no children of her own, but she hoped that when the time came, the garden would call to someone else as it had called to her so many years ago. The selection of a new keeper was not a decision made by humans. It was the garden itself that chose who would be worthy of its trust. The church bells chimed 2 o'clock, and Eleanor realized she was behind her usual schedule. She had been lingering too long in the memory grove, lost in contemplation and the hypnotic beauty of the water lilies. She gathered her tools and made her way back to the main path, moving with slightly more purpose as she headed toward the sections of the garden she had not yet visited. The next area on her route was the maze of midnight honeysuckle, a complex pattern of hedges covered in vines that bloomed only in darkness. During the day, the maze appeared to be made of ordinary green hedges with no flowers visible, but at night, it transformed into a wonderland of golden blooms that glowed with their own inner light. Eleanor entered the maze through its single opening, following paths she had memorized over decades of nightly visits. The maze was designed not to confuse or trap, but to slow down visitors, to force them to walk mindfully and appreciate the beauty surrounding them. Each turn revealed new vistas of blooming honeysuckle. Each pathway offered its own unique perspective on the garden's nocturnal magic. The honeysuckle flowers were tiny individually, but they grew in such profusion that the entire maze seemed to glow with golden light. Their fragrance was intense but not overwhelming, sweet and heady with undertones of honey and spice. Eleanor moved through the familiar turns of the maze, stopping periodically to tend to sections where the vines needed additional support or where the blooms seemed less vigorous than usual. At the center of the maze stood a small gazebo, its white pillars and curved roof providing a framework for the most spectacular honeysuckle display in the entire garden. Here, the vines had been trained to grow in complex patterns, creating living walls of golden light that surrounded a circular bench where Eleanor often rested during her nightly rounds. She settled onto the bench and pulled out her journal once more, making detailed notes about the condition of the honeysuckle and the subtle changes she had observed in its blooming patterns over the past few weeks. The autumn season brought different challenges and opportunities for the garden's plants, and Eleanor needed to adjust her care routine accordingly. As she wrote, Eleanor became aware of a soft humming sound. The singing flowers in the next section of the garden were beginning their nightly chorus. These remarkable plants produced actual music, their petals vibrating in harmony to create melodies that changed throughout the night. No two nights were ever exactly the same, as the flowers responded to subtle variations in temperature, humidity, and lunar energy. Eleanor finished her notes and made her way out of the maze, following the sound of the singing flowers toward one of the most enchanting areas of the entire garden. The path wound through stands of night-blooming bamboo, their hollow stems creating natural wind chimes that added percussion to the floral symphony ahead. The singing flowers grew in a natural amphitheater, a depression in the earth surrounded by rising terraces where different varieties of musical plants had been carefully arranged. At the bottom of the amphitheater, the base blooms provided deep, resonant tones. On the middle terraces, The melody flowers carried the main themes of the nightly compositions. At the top, the harmony bells added delicate counterpoints and ethereal overtones. Eleanor stood at the edge of the amphitheater and listened to the night's performance, feeling the music wash over her like waves of pure emotion. The songs were never melancholy or harsh. They spoke of peace, of beauty, of the eternal cycles of growth and renewal that governed all life. This was music for meditation, for healing, for the gentle restoration of the soul. She moved down into the amphitheater and began to tend the singing plants, being careful not to disturb their musical performance. These flowers required very little physical care. They thrived primarily on appreciation and attention. Eleanor's presence among them seemed to inspire them to even greater musical heights, their harmonies becoming richer and more complex as she moved from terrace to terrace. The base blooms were enormous flowers, each one the size of a dinner plate, with petals that vibrated slowly to produce their deep tones. Eleanor knelt beside them and listened to their contribution to the night's symphony, feeling the vibrations through the ground beneath her knees. These were ancient flowers, possibly among the first magical plants ever cultivated in the garden. On the middle terraces, the melody flowers swayed gently as they sang, their smaller blooms producing clear, sweet notes that carried the main themes of the musical compositions. Eleanor moved among them with reverent care, occasionally touching a petal or stem to encourage a particular plant that seemed to be struggling with its part in the chorus. At the top of the amphitheater, the harmony bells chimed in perfect synchronization, their tiny blooms producing notes so pure and clear they seemed to ring directly in Eleanor's mind rather than her ears. These were the most delicate flowers in the entire arrangement, and they required the gentlest touch and the most careful attention. As Eleanor worked among the singing plants, she felt a deep sense of privilege at being allowed to witness and participate in this nightly miracle. The music of the flowers was something that existed nowhere else in the world, a form of beauty so pure and perfect that it seemed to come from another realm entirely. The church bells chimed 3 o'clock, marking the halfway point of Eleanor's nightly vigil. She had covered roughly half the garden, tending to hundreds of different plants and flower varieties, each with its own needs and its own contribution to the garden's overall magic. The night air was growing cooler now, carrying new scents as different flowers reached their peak blooming periods. Eleanor left the amphitheater and continued along the main path, heading toward the section of the garden she had always found most mysterious, the shadow garden, where plants grew that seemed to exist more in darkness than in any physical realm. Here, the very air seemed thicker, more substantial, as if shadows had weight and presence. The plants in the shadow garden were unlike any others in the magical space. The shadow ferns grew in patterns that hurt the eyes to look at directly, their fronds seeming to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The darkness roses appeared to be holes cut in the fabric of reality, their blooms so black they seemed to absorb not just light but existence itself. Eleanor moved through this section with extra care, knowing that the plants here were more than just magical. They were connected to forces and energies that even she did not fully understand. Her care for them was more intuitive than technical, guided by instincts she had developed over decades of working with plants that defied ordinary botanical knowledge. The shadow garden required different tools and different techniques. Instead of the liquid starlight she used elsewhere, Eleanor carried a vial of what she called liquid darkness water that had been collected during a solar eclipse and stored in the deepest parts of the garden where no light ever penetrated. She used this sparingly, knowing that too much could overwhelm even the shadow-adapted plants. As she worked, Eleanor felt the presence of watchers in the darkness, not threatening, but curious. The shadow garden attracted creatures that existed on the borders between the physical and spiritual worlds. She had learned over the years to acknowledge their presence without fear, treating them as fellow guardians of the garden's mysteries. The centerpiece of the shadow garden was the Tree of Forgotten Dreams, an ancient oak whose bark appeared to be made of solidified night. During the day, the tree looked completely ordinary, but at night, its branches were filled with fruits that contained the dreams people had lost or forgotten. Eleanor tended this tree with special reverence, knowing that it held within its strange fruits the hopes and aspirations that people had given up on. She knelt at the base of the dream tree and poured a small amount of liquid darkness onto its roots, watching as the substance seemed to disappear into the earth without leaving any trace. The tree's response was immediate. Its branches stirred without any wind, and the dream fruits hanging from its limbs began to glow with a soft, pearl-like radiance. Eleanor reached up and gently touched one of the fruits, feeling the electric tingle of contact with stored dreams and memories. Through the fruit, she could sense fragments of the hopes it contained. A child's dream of flying, an artist's vision of perfect beauty, a lover's hope for eternal happiness. These dreams were not lost forever, but preserved here in the magical tree, waiting for the day when their dreamers might be ready to reclaim them. The shadow garden was always the most emotionally intense part of Eleanor's nightly rounds. The plants here dealt with the deeper aspects of human experience, with loss, with forgotten hopes, with the parts of life that people preferred not to acknowledge. But they were as important as any other section of the garden, perhaps more so, for they provided a place where even the darkest aspects of existence could be transformed into something beautiful. Eleanor made her way out of the shadow garden and back onto the main path, feeling the emotional weight of that section gradually lifting as she moved toward the lighter, more cheerful areas of the garden. The contrast was always striking, from the profound depths of the shadow plants to the gentle joy of the flowers that grew in the garden's sunnier spaces. The next section was one of her favorites, the children's garden, where flowers grew that would have delighted any child lucky enough to see them. Here were the giggling daisies that actually laughed when touched by the night breeze, the tickling grass that reached up to brush against anyone who walked through it, and the bubble flowers that released soap bubble spheres filled with rainbow light. Eleanor entered the children's garden with a lighter step, feeling her spirits lift as the playful plants responded to her presence. The giggling daisies began their soft laughter as soon as they sensed her approaching, their mirth infectious and sweet. She knelt among them and began her tending routine, but it was hard to be serious when surrounded by flowers that found such joy in simply existing. The tickling grass brushed against her arms and legs as she worked, its touch gentle and friendly rather than annoying. These plants had been specifically cultivated to bring joy and wonder to anyone who encountered them, and they succeeded brilliantly in their purpose. Eleanor often found herself smiling and sometimes even laughing out loud as she worked in this section. The bubble flowers were perhaps the most magical of all the playful plants. Each bloom, when it reached full maturity, would release a stream of iridescent bubbles that floated through the garden like tiny planets, each one containing its own miniature light show. The bubbles would drift for several minutes before gently popping, releasing showers of sparkles that settled on the surrounding plants like blessing. Eleanor tended to the bubble flowers with particular care, knowing that they required perfect balance in their soil moisture to produce their magical spheres. She had learned over the years to recognize the subtle signs that indicated when a plant was ready to begin its bubble production, and she timed her care accordingly. As she worked, Eleanor thought about the children who might have enjoyed this magical garden. She had no children of her own, and the garden's secret nature meant that it could never be shared with young visitors. But she liked to imagine their reactions to the laughing flowers and floating bubbles. Perhaps someday, when the world was different, when magic was more accepted and understood, the garden could be open to those who would appreciate its wonders most. The church bells chimed 4 o'clock, and Eleanor realized that dawn was now only a few hours away. She needed to increase her pace slightly to ensure she could complete her rounds before the first rays of sunlight began to close the magical blooms. The transition from night to day was always bittersweet for Eleanor. She treasured the quiet hours of tending the garden, and each dawn marked the end of another night in her magical sanctuary. She left the children's garden and headed toward the final major section of the garden, the Healing Grove, where plants grew that possessed remarkable restorative properties. This was perhaps the most practically useful area of the entire garden, though Eleanor rarely made use of its healing plants for her own needs. The magic here was powerful but not to be used lightly. The Healing Grove was arranged in concentric circles around a small spring that bubbled up from deep underground. The water from this spring had healing properties of its own, and it provided the perfect environment for the medicinal plants that grew around it. During the day, these plants looked like ordinary herbs and flowers, but at night, they glowed with soft, healing light and released airborne essences that could cure a wide variety of ailments. Eleanor moved through the grove slowly, checking each plant for signs of health or distress. The healing plants were among the most sensitive in the entire garden, responding not just to physical conditions but to the emotional and spiritual states of those around them. They seemed to sense Eleanor's decades of devotion and care, and they always bloomed most vigorously when she was tending them. In the innermost circle, closest to the healing spring, grew the moonleaf sage. Its silver-green leaves shimmer with their own inner light. This plant could ease pain and reduce fever, but only when harvested at the precise moment of its peak potency during the dark hours before dawn. Eleanor knelt beside the sage plants and examined them carefully, noting which ones would be ready for harvesting in the coming nights. The second circle contained the starlight lavender, its purple spikes releasing a fragrance that could calm anxiety and promote peaceful sleep. Eleanor breathed deeply of this natural aromatherapy as she checked the soil moisture around each plant. The lavender required careful attention to drainage, as its magical properties could be diminished by too much water pooling around its roots. In the third circle grew the night-blooming chamomile, its small white flowers opening like tiny stars against the dark earth. This chamomile was far more potent than its daytime cousins, capable of soothing both physical ailments and troubled minds. Eleanor gathered a few of the fully opened blooms, knowing that she would dry them carefully and store them for future use. The outermost circle contained the most powerful healing plants, the lunar willowbark trees, whose bark could ease pain and reduce inflammation, and the midnight comfrey, whose leaves could accelerate the healing of wounds and broken bones. Eleanor approached these plants with special reverence, knowing that their power came with great responsibility. As she tended to the healing plants, Eleanor thought about the few times over the years when she had needed to use their properties. A severe fever that had lasted for days, a broken wrist from a fall on the garden paths, various minor ailments that came with age and a lifetime of physical work. The plants had always provided exactly what she needed, but she was careful never to take their gifts for granted. The healing spring at the center of the grove bubbled continuously, its water clear and pure as liquid crystal. Eleanor knelt beside it and filled a small vial with the healing water, knowing that it would remain potent for months if stored properly. She had never fully understood the source of the spring's power, but she suspected it was connected to the same mysterious forces that gave the entire garden its magical properties. As she worked in the healing grove, Eleanor felt a deep sense of gratitude for the privilege of tending these remarkable plants. The healing properties they possessed could have revolutionized medicine if they could be studied and cultivated in the ordinary world. But Eleanor knew that their power was inextricably linked to the magical environment of the Midnight Garden. They would lose their special properties if removed from this sacred space. The church bells chimed 4:30, and Eleanor realized she was entering the final phase of her nightly routine. Dawn was still more than an hour away, but she needed to begin preparing for the garden's daily transformation back to its dormant state. This preparation was as important as the tending itself, ensuring that the plants would remain healthy and ready for the next night's blooming. Eleanor left the healing grove and made her way to the final section of the garden she had not yet visited, the reflection pools, a series of interconnected ponds where the rarest and most mysterious water plants grew. These pools were fed by underground streams that connected to the healing spring, creating a network of magical waterways throughout the garden. The water in the reflection pools was so still and clear that it acted like mirrors, reflecting not just the night sky above but also showing glimpses of other times and places. Eleanor had learned over the years not to stare too long into these waters, as they could show visions that were both beautiful and disturbing, glimpses of possible futures and half-remembered pasts. The plants that grew in and around the reflection pools were among the most exotic in the entire garden. The crystal lotus flowers floated on the surface like living jewels, their petals so translucent they seemed to be made of frozen light. The moonmist cattails grew along the edges of the pools, releasing gentle clouds of luminescent spores that drifted across the water like earthbound stars. Eleanor moved carefully around the pools, using a long-handled net to remove any debris that might have fallen into the water during the day. The aquatic plants were particularly sensitive to impurities, and maintaining the perfect clarity and purity of their environment was essential to their continued health and magical properties. The crystal lotus flowers were just beginning to reach their full nighttime glory, their petals opening wider to reveal centers that pulsed with soft, rhythmic light. Each flower was unique, with its own pattern of colors and light that seemed to correspond to some cosmic rhythm Eleanor had never fully understood. She watched them with fascination, noting the subtle variations that made each bloom an individual work of art. The moonmist cattails required different care, their spore production dependent on gentle air circulation and precise water temperature. Eleanor used a small paddle to create gentle currents in the pools, ensuring that the water remained in constant, slow motion. The cattails responded immediately, releasing more of their luminescent spores into the night air. As Eleanor worked around the reflection pools, she caught occasional glimpses in the water's surface of scenes that seemed to come from other times and places. She saw a young woman in old-fashioned dress tending similar magical gardens, perhaps one of her predecessors from centuries past. She glimpsed a future garden where the plants grew even more magnificent than they did now, tended by hands she did not recognize. These visions were part of the mystery of the reflection pools, windows into the eternal nature of the garden that existed outside normal time and space. Eleanor had learned to accept them as part of the garden's magic without trying to understand or control them. They were reminders that her work was part of something much larger than her individual life, a continuation of an ancient tradition that would persist long after she was gone. The church bells chimed 5 o'clock, marking the beginning of the final hour before dawn. Eleanor quickened her pace slightly, knowing that she needed to complete her rounds and begin the closing preparations that would prepare the garden for its daily dormancy. The transition from night to day was a delicate process that required careful timing and attention to detail. She made her way back toward the center of the garden, stopping at various flower beds to make final adjustments and observations. The moonlight jasmine was beginning to show the first subtle signs of preparing to close, the edges of their petals curling slightly inward, their luminescence starting to fade. The lunar roses were still in full bloom, but Eleanor could sense the change beginning in them as well. At the central fountain, Eleanor refilled her watering can one last time with liquid starlight, knowing that she would need it for the final rounds of care before dawn arrived. The fountain itself was beginning to change, the liquid starlight gradually becoming clearer and more like ordinary water as the magical peak of the night began to pass. Eleanor made her way through each section of the garden systematically, checking on plants she had tended earlier to ensure they were transitioning properly toward their day state. The dream lilies were closing their star-filled petals, their magical mist dissipating into the cooling night air. The crystal bells had stopped their chiming and were becoming translucent, preparing to become invisible during the daylight hours. In the memory grove, the ancient trees were beginning to dim their phosphorescent glow, their branches settling into the stillness they would maintain during the day. The water lilies on the central pond were closing their blooms petal by petal, a process as mesmerizing as their opening had been hours earlier. The maze of midnight honeysuckle was losing its golden glow, the thousands of tiny blooms beginning to fade and close as the vines prepared to return to their ordinary daytime appearance. Eleanor walked through the familiar paths one last time, saying silent farewells to each section as it prepared for its daily rest. In the children's garden, the giggling daisies were growing quiet, their laughter becoming softer and less frequent. The bubble flowers released their final streams of iridescent spheres, creating one last magical display before settling into dormancy. The tickling grass was becoming still, no longer reaching out to brush against Eleanor's legs as she passed. The healing grove was undergoing its own transition, the medicinal plants losing their luminous glow as their magical properties prepared to go dormant for the day. Eleanor made final notes in her journal about which plants would need special attention the following night, which ones were showing signs of particular vigor or distress. At the reflection pools, the crystal lotus flowers were closing their jewel-like petals, sinking slightly lower in the water as they prepared for their day-long rest. The moon mist cattails had stopped releasing their luminescent spores, and the pools themselves were becoming ordinary water once again, losing their ability to show visions of other times and places. The shadow garden was perhaps the most dramatic in its transformation, as the plants that lived there faded almost completely from sight as dawn approached. The shadow ferns became nearly invisible, their multidimensional fronds folding back into ordinary physical space. The darkness roses lost their reality-bending properties and became simple dark flowers that would be barely noticeable during the day. As Eleanor completed her final rounds, she could sense the approaching dawn even though the sky was still dark. The garden itself seemed to be preparing for sleep, the magical energies that had been so vibrant throughout the night beginning to ebb and flow toward their daytime rest. This was always the most poignant moment of Eleanor's nightly vigil, the time when the extraordinary was preparing to become ordinary once again. The church bells chimed 5:30, and Eleanor knew that dawn was less than an hour away. She made her way to a small stone bench near the central fountain where she always concluded her nightly routine, settling down with her journal to make her final entries for the night. October 15th into 16th. Complete garden tending completed successfully. All plant communities showing excellent health and vigor. Moonlight jasmine opened at 12:05, closed at 5:25. Lunar roses peaked at 2:15. Dream lilies released optimal healing mist. Crystal bells harmonized beautifully. Healing grove plants all responded well to care. No maintenance issues identified. Weather conditions ideal throughout the night. Preparing for dawn closure. As she wrote, Eleanor could see the first subtle lightening of the eastern sky, the deep black of night beginning to give way to the dark gray that preceded true dawn. This was the signal for the garden's final transformation, as the magical plants prepared to return to their dormant daytime state. Eleanor closed her journal and sat quietly on the bench, watching as the miracle of the midnight garden prepared to reverse itself. One by one, the glowing flowers dimmed their light. One by one, the magical blooms began to close their petals. One by one, the extraordinary became ordinary again, leaving behind only the memory of beauty and magic in the darkness. The fountain at the center of the garden was the last to change, its liquid starlight gradually becoming clear water as the final traces of magic withdrew for the day. Eleanor watched this transformation with the same wonder she had felt for more than 40 years, knowing that she was witnessing something that few humans had ever been privileged to see. As the first ray of actual sunlight touched the top of the garden's walls, the transformation was complete. The midnight garden had returned to its daytime appearance, an ordinary collection of green plants and empty flower beds, showing no trace of the magic that had filled every corner just moments before. Eleanor rose from the bench and gathered her tools, preparing to return to her small cottage at the garden's edge. Her nightly work was complete, but already she was looking forward to the sunset that would begin the cycle anew. In just a few hours, as darkness fell once again, the garden would stir to life, and Eleanor would be there to witness and tend another night of magic. She walked slowly toward the garden's entrance, her bare feet finding the familiar path without conscious thought. Behind her, the ordinary garden showed no sign of the wonders it had contained throughout the night. But Eleanor carried those wonders with her, in her memory, in her journal, and in the deep satisfaction that came from a lifetime devoted to tending something beautiful and magical and eternal. The iron gate closed silently behind her as Eleanor made her way toward her cottage, where she would rest during the daylight hours, dreaming of flowers that bloomed in starlight and gardens that existed only in the gentle embrace of the night. Tomorrow evening, when the sun set once again, she would return to begin another night of magic, another cycle in the eternal rhythm of the midnight garden, where beauty lived in darkness and miracles bloomed under the silver light of the moon. In her cottage, Eleanor prepared a simple breakfast and settled by her window to watch the sunrise paint the sky in gentle pastels of pink and gold. The ordinary world was waking up to another day, but Eleanor was part of a different rhythm, a magical cycle that connected her to mysteries most people never imagined existed. As the morning light grew stronger, Eleanor felt the peaceful exhaustion that came after a night of devoted work. She would sleep soon, resting through the daylight hours so that she would be ready for another night in the garden. This was her life, her calling, her gift to the world, tending a place where magic lived and beauty bloomed in the gentle darkness of the midnight hours. The garden slept, but its magic was not gone, only waiting for the return of night to bloom once again in all its mysterious glory.